This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging into a situation in Nepal that, honestly, just doesn't quite add up at first glance. It's been called the farmer's paradox.
That's right. The picture painted by the sources we looked at is, well, it's striking. You have farmers working incredibly hard, often bringing in really abundant harvests.
And then, boom, the market price for that very same produce just crashes. Sometimes it gets so low it's not even worth picking, They're forced to just leave it or discard it.
Exactly. Producing plenty, but getting almost nothing for it.
Right. But here's the paradox part. At the same time, maybe just a few hours drive away, people in the cities, the consumers, they're paying way, way more for the exact same stuff.
It's a major disconnect. The source gives this really vivid example, doesn't it? A farmer down in Chitwan, maybe looking at a field full of ripe tomatoes, facing prices that mean waste.
Yeah.
While someone shopping in Kathmandu is paying maybe 5 times that price per kilo. It just shines a light on a system that's, well, fundamentally broken somewhere.
And we should stress, this isn't some small corner of the economy. Agriculture is, it's the backbone of Nepal. It gives jobs to, over 60% of the workforce and contributes a huge chunk, like a quarter of the GDP.
Absolutely. Yet the very people doing this foundational work, these smallholder farmers, they're stuck in this state of constant financial worry. It's a tough situation.
So that's our mission today, digging into these sources. We want to understand why this paradox exists. What are the structural weaknesses, the market forces squeezing these farmers?
And crucially, what does the material suggest are the real pathways forward? The strategies that are actually working or could work to help farmers, take back some control and build a more secure future.
Okay, so let's start by dissecting those problems, what the source kind of labels the great squeeze. Then we'll shift gears and look at the solutions, the ways farmers can fight back.
Sounds good. So the great squeeze. The sources really describe a market structure that's, well, it's messy, disorganized, yes, but also heavily tilted against the farmer.
And the main problem, surprisingly, isn't necessarily a lack of demand in the cities. It's how the food actually gets from the farm to the consumer. We're talking a supply chain that can involve, get this, up to 7 different middlemen.
7. Yeah, just pause on that for a second. Every single layer adds steps, adds cost, adds their own profit margin.
And it builds up fast.
Exactly. And that's where this huge price gap comes from. The source mentions, something costing maybe 10 rupees at the farm can easily end up selling for 70 rupees or even more by the time it hits the retail shelf.
Wow, a 700% markup. That's huge. The source had some specifics too, didn't it? Like that Pokhara market study?
It did. They looked at the wholesale market there for fresh veggies and found the average price spread, the difference between farm gate and wholesale, was over 57%, which means the farmer is left with less than 43% of that price.
Less than half.
Less than half. And remember those tomatoes. NPR 12 a kilo at the main Kalamati wholesale market in Kathmandu would jump across town to Koteshwar, and suddenly they're NPR 60 a kilo in the shops.
So why? Why does this complex, multi-layered system even exist? Is it just exploitation?
Well, exploitation is definitely part of it, but it's not the whole story. The source points out that most farmers in Nepal are smallholders. They're often spread out, geographically isolated, especially up in the hills.
Right. Getting small amounts of produce to market over rough terrain is tough for one person.
Exactly. And the big missing piece, according to the source, is basic infrastructure. Think about it. Poor rural roads make transport slow, difficult, expensive. And there's a massive lack of cold storage facilities.
So if you pick it, you basically have to sell it today.
Pretty much. Or risk losing the whole lot to spoilage. So that forces an immediate sale right when the harvest comes in. And that puts the farmer in a really, really weak negotiating spot.
Okay, so the middlemen step in to fill that gap, providing the transport, the aggregation.
They do. They provide a necessary function in the current system. But because the farmer has so few options and needs to sell urgently, the middlemen can dictate terms and capture most of the value.
And the result isn't just unfairness. It actually discourages farming, right? Threatens food security in the long run.
Absolutely. It undermines motivation and makes farming seem like a losing game, which is dangerous for the whole country.
Okay, so that's one layer of the squeeze. But then the source talks about this double trap involving imports. What's that about?
Yeah, it's like farmers are getting hit from 2 sides with imports. First, there's direct competition. Cheaper farm products, especially from India, flood the market.
Undercutting local prices.
Exactly. Even if Nepalese farmers are efficient. The source gives an example. Maybe it costs a local farmer NPR 25 to produce a kilo of potatoes, But if cheaper imports come in below that, they're forced to sell at a loss just to move their crop.
Ouch. So they can't even compete on price sometimes. What's the second part of the trap?
The second part is their dependence on imported inputs, particularly chemical fertilizers. Nepal needs a huge amount every year. The source estimates around 550,000 to 600,000 metric tons.
And most of that has to be imported.
Almost all of it. And the supply chain for that is often unreliable, too. Shortages happen.
And I remember reading the government spends a lot subsidizing these chemical imports.
A huge amount. The source tallied it up over 5 years. Something like NPR 107 billion, that's a billion with a B, allocated to agricultural subsidies. And over 83% of that massive budget went specifically to subsidizing imported chemical fertilizers.
Wow. But doesn't that create a massive vulnerability, relying so heavily on imports?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
It makes farmers and the whole agricultural sector incredibly vulnerable to global price shocks and supply disruptions. Remember when the war in Ukraine kicked off?
Yeah.
Urea prices, a key fertilizer, apparently went from around $390 a ton to over $1,000 a ton almost overnight. How can a small farmer possibly plan or budget with that kind of volatility?
It's impossible. Just adds another layer of risk.
And here's where the source points out a really big policy contradiction. The government says it wants to promote local, sustainable organic farming. There are policies aimed at that. But then it pumps billions into subsidizing imported chemical fertilizers. Those subsidies make the chemicals artificially cheap, which directly undermines the economic case for farmers to switch to local, organic alternatives in the short term. The policies are kind of working against each other.
So the money is actually propping up the very system of dependence they say they want to move away from?
Well, that's essentially what the source suggests. It perpetuates this high-risk, often unsustainable model.
Okay, so the government isn't completely absent. They do try things like setting a minimum support price or MSP for some crops, but the source seems skeptical about how effective these are.
Yeah, the intention is good. Setting an MSP for something like paddy rice, for example, aims to provide a safety net. But the source argues they often fail in practice.
Why is that?
Well, a couple of reasons mentioned. Often there's no strong legal basis or effective way to actually enforce the MSP. Plus, they tend to set the price way too early, like before planting even starts.
So it doesn't reflect the actual costs or market situation when the harvest comes?
Exactly. Yeah. It doesn't account for all the risks the farmer faces during the growing season, or the actual supply and demand dynamics at harvest time. So the announced price might sound okay initially, but it doesn't always translate into a fair deal when it matters.
And other programs, like promoting organic farming locally.
Similar issues, according to the source. Good ideas, like encouraging local governments to allocate extra budget for organic promotion, but the implementation on the ground is often weak or inconsistent.
So it sounds like a pattern. Good policies on paper, but a struggle to make them work effectively.
That's the recurring theme highlighted. A gap between policy pronouncements and consistent, effective execution. The source calls it a governance gap.
And that must damage trust, right, between farmers and the state.
It absolutely does. If farmers feel like the support systems aren't reliable or the rules aren't enforced fairly, it makes it harder for the state to be seen as a helpful partner. It suggests the challenge isn't always a lack of ideas, but maybe more about the institutional muscle and political follow-through needed to make those ideas reality.
Right. So we've laid out this great squeeze, the middleman maze, the import dependency, the policies that don't quite hit the mark. It does sound pretty daunting.
It is a complex set of challenges, no doubt.
But thankfully, the source material doesn't just leave us there. It also digs into solutions, concrete ways farmers are starting to, or could, push back and gain more control.
Yes, absolutely. Despite how deep these systemic problems run, the sources are quite positive about identifying strategies that are already showing results on the ground. Often, they involve farmers working together, finding smarter ways to connect to markets, and adding value themselves.
Okay, let's talk about that first point, working together. The source puts a lot of emphasis on agricultural cooperatives.
Yes, this comes up again and again as a really powerful tool. Think back to that isolated smallholder with weak bargaining power. When farmers band together in a cooperative, that dynamic shifts.
They get collective clout.
Exactly. They can negotiate better prices as a group. The source suggests co-op members often get 10 to 20% higher prices for their produce compared to selling alone.
That 10–20% could be the difference between profit and loss for many.
For sure. It's significant. And co-ops help in other ways too. They can lower marketing costs by pooling transport, maybe investing together in storage, cutting down on commission fees paid to middlemen. They can basically shorten that supply chain by dealing directly with bigger buyers or markets.
And it's not just about selling, is it? The source mentioned other services.
Right. The really successful ones become these vital support ecosystems. They help members get access to credit, which is often a huge barrier. They can bulk buy quality seeds or other inputs at better prices. And they often provide technical training, helping farmers improve their methods.
The source had some really good examples. Tell us about that women's dairy co-op, Sri Kamalamai.
Yeah, that's a great story. These women organized, gave them initial support, and Training Heifer International was involved. And then they managed to set up a solid agreement with a dairy processor, Sujal Dairy.
So a guaranteed market and reliable payments.
Exactly. And that stability allowed them to really grow. Their daily milk collection apparently jumped from 500 liters up to 1,300 liters. That's real, tangible income improvement for the members.
And the vegetable and fruit co-op, Janagrathi.
Another example of collective bargaining power. They managed to negotiate prices in Chitwan that were NPR 16.40 per kilo higher for their members than what others were getting through different channels.
That's substantial. And there was a big tea cooperative, too.
Yes, the Central Tea Cooperative Federation represents something like 6,200 farmers. They provide technical help, support for getting organic certification, which opens up new markets, and they even help access international buyers.
Wow. And what about that innovative model, Kisan Kopoko?
Ah, yes, that's really interesting. It's promoted by the main National Co-op Federation. It's essentially a cooperative to cooperative or C2C model.
Right.
The idea is to directly link the rural co-ops producing the food with consumer co-ops or dedicated marketplaces in the cities.
Cutting out even more middlemen layers.
Precisely. It's a really smart way to tackle that core supply chain problem directly.
So the takeaway on co-ops is they're not just about selling. They're about building a whole support structure.
Exactly. When they work well, and especially when they get the right kind of external support and market links, they show how collective action can really address multiple aspects of that great squeeze simultaneously.
Okay, another strategy the source explores is contract farming. This is where farmers agree on a deal with a company before they even plant, right?
That's the basic model, yes. A company, maybe a processor or a larger retailer, agrees upfront to buy the farmer's harvest at a set price. Often the company might also provide inputs like specific seeds or fertilizer and maybe some technical guidance.
And the main appeal for the farmer is?
Reduced risk. The source highlights that it's meant to take away the uncertainty about finding a buyer and what price they'll get. It offers the promise of a guaranteed market and a more stable income.
Does the source show this working in Nepal? Are farmers actually better off?
There is evidence of benefits, yes. The source cites examples like paddy seed farmers under contract, reporting profits about 23% higher than independent farmers, and ginger farmers, doing contract farming, saw even bigger gains, 58% higher net profits.
58%? What drove that?
According to the source, it was a combination of getting better prices through the contract, but also having access to better quality seeds and receiving specific training from the company involved. So the potential is definitely there.
Okay, that sounds pretty positive, but you hinted earlier it could be a double-edged sword. What are the downsides the source points out?
Right. There are significant risks. A big one is the potential loss of bargaining power. Farmers might get locked into a deal with one powerful company.
So they can't shop around or benefit if market prices unexpectedly shoot up higher than their contract price.
Exactly. They miss out on those potential windfall gains. There's also the risk, especially with less scrupulous companies, that production risks like crop failure due to weather might get unfairly shifted onto the farmer. But maybe the most critical issue, the real red flag raised by the source, is the lack of a proper legal framework for this in Nepal.
Meaning there aren't clear rules.
Precisely. Contract farming is mentioned in policies, but there isn't a specific strong law that clearly defines the terms, protects small farmers' rights within these contracts, or sets up a clear way to resolve disputes if things go wrong.
So if a farmer feels they're getting a raw deal from the company, they don't have much legal standing to fight back.
That's the major concern. The source really stresses this point. Without the government stepping in to create clear, fair, and enforceable rules of the game, just expanding contract farming could end up creating more dependence, not empowerment. Its success really hinges on getting that legal structure right.
Okay, moving beyond just selling the raw harvest, the source also talks about the potential in adding value through local processing.
Yes, this is about farmers capturing more of that final price themselves. Right now, a lot of potential income is lost simply because produce spoils after harvest or because it's sold in its most basic perishable form.
So instead of just selling raw tomatoes, maybe drying them or making pickles.
Exactly. Things like that. The source mentions traditional Nepalese processed products like gundruk, that fermented leafy green, or sinki, which is dried radish, pickles, dried fruits like datura or marcha. These simple traditional methods drastically increase shelf life and value.
And are there accessible technologies to help with this?
Yes, the source highlights things like low-cost plastic solar dryers. Apparently, these can be made using local materials and are great for small-scale drying fruits like apples, vegetables, spices, even coffee, particularly in areas off the grid. And simpler tools too, like basic handheld coffee peelers or junior washers, can make a difference at the local level.
And does organizing this processing help, maybe through co-ops again?
Definitely. The source mentions government and NGO programs like One Village, One Product, or specific projects focused on ginger or citrus processing, and cooperative packing houses where produce can be properly sorted, graded, and maybe even packaged. These community or co-op efforts help pool resources and knowledge for value addition.
So this is really about farmers moving up the value chain, not just being at the bottom producing the raw material.
Exactly. It gives them much more control. They're less pressured by perishability, they can choose when to sell, and they can access different, often higher-paying markets for processed goods rather than just selling raw commodities right after harvest.
Lastly, the source looks at the role of technology, specifically digital tools, kind of a digital assistant for farmers.
Right. The idea is to tackle that information gap we talked about. Farmers often lack good, timely info on crucial things. What are the going market prices today? What's the specific weather forecast for my area? How do I deal with this pest attacking my crop? Digital platforms could potentially deliver all that.
Are there actual platforms doing this in Nepal now?
Yes, the source names a few. There's an app called GeoKrishi that offers hyperlocal weather, farming advice tailored to the location, real-time market prices, and even a feature to ask questions to experts. There are also government platforms trying to link farmers to markets electronically, like Krishi Bazaar and eHat Bazaar, and international ones like the FAO's Teleplant Doctor app for identifying crop diseases from photos.
That all sounds incredibly useful, but is it actually reaching the farmers? Are they using these tools?
Well, that's the major hurdle the source points out. The potential is huge, but the reality on the ground is different. One study mentioned found that only about 3.5% of rural farmers were actively using any agricultural apps.
Only 3.5%. That's tiny. Why so low with all these potential benefits?
The barriers are pretty significant, and they're linked. Basic infrastructure is one: limited internet access in many rural areas. Only 39% had it in that study. Plus, the high cost of mobile data is a big factor for poor farmers.
Okay, access is an issue. What else?
Digital literacy is a massive one. The source cited high illiteracy rates, generally over 45% in rural areas in that survey. And specifically on using tech, a staggering 95% of farmers surveyed had never received any training on how to use agricultural apps. People find the interfaces confusing or just too complicated.
Makes sense. If you haven't been trained, even a simple app can seem daunting. Is there a gender aspect too?
Yes, the source notes that women farmers often have even less access to mobile phones or the money for data plans compared to men. And on top of all that, many apps just aren't designed well for the context. They might need constant internet or be heavily text-based, which doesn't work well without literacy, or if voice or video would be more intuitive.
So it's not enough to just build the tech. You need the whole support system around it.
Precisely. The source's key takeaway here isn't that digital tools are useless, but that just throwing apps at the problem won't work. The recommended approach is what they call a hybrid physical-digital strategy.
Hybrid, how does that work?
It means using the power of digital to gather and analyze information, but then using trusted physical channels to get that information to the farmers. The source strongly suggests partnering with existing local institutions, especially cooperatives.
So train people at the co-op to use the apps and platforms.
Exactly. Train co-op staff or local extension workers. They become the intermediaries who access the digital info, market prices, weather warnings, pest alerts, and then they share it with the farmers through channels they already use and trust. Community meetings, face-to-face chats, maybe even local radio or notice boards. Geokrishi's model of partnering with co-ops was given as an example of this working.
So it bridges that digital divide by using a trusted human link.
Exactly. It gets the information to the farmers in a format they can actually use and act upon. So putting it all together, we've seen the really tough challenges squeezing Nepalese farmers, but also these clear, promising pathways outlined in the source material.
Yeah, and it really comes across that there's no single silver bullet, is there? The sources really emphasize that lasting change needs this kind of integrated approach. You need the collective action of co-ops, maybe fairer partnerships like well-regulated contract farming, definitely embracing that value add through processing.
And using technology smartly, bridging that digital gap rather than just assuming everyone can use an app. The successful initiatives seem to be the ones that tackle several of these issues at once: market access, finance, training, collective organization.
And underlying a lot of this, the source makes a really strong argument for a strategic shift towards self-sufficiency, right?
Yeah.
Especially moving away from that risky dependence on imported chemical fertilizers.
Absolutely. Pushing towards more local, sustainable, organic methods isn't just presented as an environmental goal, though it is that too. It's framed as a critical economic strategy.
Using things like vermicomposting, green manures, or local biofertilizers like geomol that farmers can potentially make themselves.
Exactly. The benefits highlighted are multiple. It cuts input costs, reduces that dangerous reliance on volatile global supplies, helps rebuild soil health for better long-term yields, and makes farms more resilient to climate change impacts.
So the source boils this down into some pretty clear recommendations for different groups.
Yes, quite actionable ones. For the government and policymakers, the big message seem to be: seriously consider redirecting those huge chemical subsidies towards supporting the transition to organic farming. Help set up local input production. Maybe offer support to farmers during that switchover period.
And crucially, create that proper legal framework for contract farming we talked about.
Yes, urgently. And keep investing in the basics. Better rural roads, more cold storage, and expanding affordable internet access in rural areas.
Okay. And for development partners, NGOs.
The source suggests they should really focus on promoting and supporting that hybrid physical-digital model for getting information out, and hoping to establish more of those cooperative-based processing and packing facilities to boost local value addition.
And finally, for the farmers themselves, the ones right in the middle of this paradox.
The advice drawn from the source is pretty direct. Get organized. Join or form cooperatives to build collective strength and access support. And actively develop the skills and adopt the practices for local processing and making your own organic fertilizers, taking control of both costs and value.
It really sounds like the sources see a genuine potential for farmers in Nepal to flip the script, doesn't it? To move from vulnerability towards strength.
It does. The message is that through a combination of collective action, pushing for fairer systems, embracing innovations that actually fit their context, and committing to more sustainable, localized practices, they really can build a more equitable and resilient farming future. It's about moving beyond just scraping by.
So thinking about all these pathways, especially that shift towards adding value locally through processing and creating their own inputs through organic methods, it makes you wonder, how might the whole identity of a farmer in Nepal change? Moving beyond just being a producer of raw stuff to becoming, a skilled value creator or processor, and maybe even more visibly, an essential steward of the land. Something to think about.